In this demo, I'm going to demonstrate how to start SolrCloud in AWS, primarily with a focus as a development environment. At the end of this demo, you should be able to start your own cluster comprised of 2 nodes and an external Zookeeper, verify the cluster is running and operable. We're going to populate the cluster with some data, query the cluster and verify the results. And most importantly, I'm going to try to keep this presentation under 20 minutes. My name is Germán Gutierrez, and I've been working with Solr since version 2 and with Lucene since version 1. My background is in cloud computing and big data with a focus on machine learning, and I'm primarily dealing with predictive analytics with events and human behavior. With that said, let's go into the Solr demo. Here you see the software and cloud platform that I'll be using. With respect to Solr, I'll be using Solr 7.4, Zookeeper 3.413. All the instances that I'll be running are going to be using Java 1.8. I'll be using Firefox as the main browser. I'll also be using a shell script that I wrote that will allow you to start the cluster once Zookeeper is up and running. And the EC2 instances that I'll be using will be a T2 extra large and a T2 micro. And I'll be using a mixture of Ubuntu and Red Hat for the operating system. Here, you see the 3 VMs that I have running. The main ones are the Solr 7.4 and the Zookeeper. The Jetty instance is just a HTTP server that I have running that will allow me to populate the index with some data. It doesn't have nothing to do with how Solr works. It's just for me to send some data into the cluster. On the right hand side, you'll see that Zookeeper is going to be running on Ubuntu on a T2 macro, and Solr will be running on a T2 extra large using Red Hat. The end goal is to have something similar to what you have on the screen, where you have a collection called public companies that is comprised of 2 shards, and we will verify once everything is up and running. So without further ado, let's go into the demo. The steps that I will follow will be to start Zookeeper, upload the config sets, which is essentially the schema and solrconfig.xml files onto Zookeeper. I will then dynamically create the directory structure that the cluster is going to need for each of the nodes, start the SolrCloud nodes, verify the cluster, and then dynamically index some data. So let's go to the next screen, and here you have 3 windows or 3 terminals. The bottom one is Zookeeper, the middle one is Solr, and then the top one is the indexer. Our main focus will be these 2 here, the Solr and Zookeeper. Please note that prior to me doing this presentation, I went and downloaded the binaries for Solr and Zookeeper, and I installed them on each server. So with that said, let's start with Zookeeper. And if you look here, this is a Zookeeper directory. And what we're going to do is go into the bin directory and execute the following command to start Zookeeper. This point is pretty simple. Zookeeper is running, and I'm using the zoo.cfg. And in that file, I modified to use port 9181 instead of the default, which is 2181. Now that Solr is, now that Zookeeper is up and running, our next step is to start Solr. So now we're going to the Solr VM, and if I do an ls, here you will see 2 directories and a script file, start SolrCloud. The config set is essentially the directory that I have my managed schema and my solrconfig.xml for this particular demo, and then the Solr.4.0 is the actual binaries that I downloaded from the Solr website. The start script is going to references the config sets directory and also the Solr binaries. So with that said, let's start the cluster. So just real quick, this script will prompt you for 3 questions. One will be the collection name, the initial port that you want to use, and the number of shards that you want your collection to have. So here I'm going to start a collection called public companies. We're going to use port 4500 as the initial port, and it'll be comprised of 2 shards. Okay, so now pretty much everything is done. The next step to do is to verify that the cluster is up and running. So here on the web browser, you see the 3 VMs that I have running, primarily the Solr one. So what we're going to do is we're going to go in using the public IP, try to hit that Solr instance on port 4500. So I will cheat a little bit as I have that information already here. And there, so the cluster is running. We can verify that it is. Here is the public company, 2 shards. If we go and query that cluster, there should be no data in there. You notice there's no records. None found is set to 0. And the the logging, there's no errors. And going back to here, no data. So the next step, now that we confirm that the cluster is running, we need to get some data into the cluster. So if I go back to the indexer, here I have a Jetty instance and a program that I wrote that will allow me to send data into the cluster. There's a directory called downloads, NASDAQ. And in this directory, I have three CSV files, which is essentially have a servlet that will read this directory and will process each file. And all they contain are the companies that are associated under each exchange. So with that said, let me start the Jetty server here. So it's up and running. So what I can do now is open a new tab. And again, I'm going to cheat again. And here is the URL to that Jetty instance. And what I'm doing is I'm going to execute this servlet that's going to process those 3 files. It takes roughly about maybe 10 seconds for it to process. Okay, so it's done, and as you can see, for the MX file, it did 294 records. The NASDAQ, it processed 3,389, and from the AYSC, it did 2,596 records. The non-alpha values you see there, those are erroneous records that I identified within that data set. So now if we go back to Solr and we execute a query, you will notice now we have 6,279 records, right? And if we do a fastest search on, let's do the exchange, and let me set this just to 1. So when we retrieve all the records, you will notice that we have this many records per exchange. So essentially, these values should match what you see here, which if you compare is 33989 for the NASDAQ, 2596 for an NYSE, and 294 for Amex. And there it is. So at this point, what we have is essentially simple records that contains the exchange, the stock symbol, and the company name. To do a little bit more for the demo on this, I have a user interface that I personally use for some of the financial information that I process for investing. But in this demo, let's process Netflix, and I'll explain 31 what I'll do. So here what this application does is essentially goes get some data from the web and indexes in Solr, and then it does some dynamically graphical representation and some analytics that predicts where the market is moving. So anyway, I do a quick search. I'm trying to get data for Netflix, and what this does is it goes to an external website, brings the open, the high, the low, and the close, and it does some computation and essentially renders this information. So now if we go back to the index, before we have 6,279 records, I believe I have it set to 66 records to retrieve. And if I do another search, the number should increase to 6,345. And if I do, instead of exchange doc type, we will have two types of records. We will have company and stock. If we do, let's do another one just for kicks. Amazon. There it is. And Apple. Just doing this so I can show you that the index is actually processing data. So if I do a faceted, the stock should increase, but the company record should remain the same. And there it is. So with that said, we verify that the cluster is running. We are able to populate the index with some data, but most importantly, we are able to query the data from Solr that essentially renders this information right here. So going back to the presentation, these are the steps that we did, and we verify some data. Here I'm just displaying the commands that I use to start Zookeeper. It's very straightforward. If you go to their website, the documentation I think is pretty good. And then here's the snapshot of the shell script that I use. And again, it asks you three questions: the collection name, the port, the initial port, and the number of shards. If you notice above, there are some default parameters that I set. And this is pretty much the location of the Solr binaries where I want the index data to reside, and essentially the Zookeeper ensemble. In this case, I'm just using one, but if you're using an ensemble which should be comprised of an odd number, you will have a comma delimited string there, and then the default host is the IP address of the Solr server, and the config set, which is the config set that contains the managed schema in the Solr and whatnot. And to show you where the data reside, so here in Solr, the script dynamically creates this folder, SolrCloud, and there is a folder called data, and there should be another folder under this data called public companies, and public companies contains the nodes number 1 and 2 that the cluster uses. So if we go here and dash, in this information, you will notice that for this 4500 is on the path, and if we go to 4501, it'll say 2, which essentially, points to this location right here. And with respect to the script, once you have all this information, I want to show you where you can go and download the script that you'll need to, or that I use to start the cluster. But fairly quickly, just let me bring it up here. And here's essentially the script that I use. It's just a nicer way and colorful. Here are what I prompt you for the 3 questions. And the code below I think is pretty self-explanatory if you're familiar with scripting, where essentially it just goes and loops through the number of shards you specify, and it creates the directory structure, uploads the configs to Zookeeper, and it does all the magic as specified earlier in these steps right here. So again, the Zookeeper commands that I use. Here is the snippet of what the script does with the questions and whatnot, and the replication factor of 1, where you can download the shell script that I use. I will put the link below on the description of this YouTube video. And lastly are the software that I use. I use Solr, Zookeeper, Jetty. For the UI that you saw, I'm using a mixture of Vue.js and high charts and bootstraps. I think those are, um, I'm not I'm not getting paid anything from them, but I just like their API are very easy to use, and I like using it. And lastly, here are just their icons, just giving them credit for you know the work that they do. So thank you again, and as always, feel free to put any comments, good or bad. I just hope that this information helps some of you start your own cluster and start playing with SolrCloud and the things that you can do, especially with large data sets. Thank you and have fun, and just shoot me any comments or questions that you have via the YouTube. Thank you and take care.